Hi everyone and welcome to the webinar. I will start by introducing myself. I'm Eleanor Wilson from Macmillan International Higher Education and I'll be managing the webinar today. Just one thing before I hand over to Sarah and Chris, and that is that to maintain the audio quality today, all attendees will be automatically on mute. However, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please do this in the chat box or the questions box, and I will direct those to Sarah and Chris throughout the webinar. So now to hand over to Sarah and Chris.
Thank you very much, Eleanor. If you could share the slides for us, please, that would be super. And while you're doing that, I'll just say hello to everybody and thank you very much for inviting us along to do this session. It's really exciting to watch the number of attendees going up there as we're just waiting for you all to log in. Yeah, we're here to talk a little bit about live online learning, which has suddenly become quite an important issue for many educators. And I should just say, to start us off, that Chris and I are here really on behalf of a team from the School of Education at the University of Aberdeen. You can see two more names on the front of the book that we've written together there, Jan and Carol, who I think may be lurking in the audience, and you may see them pop up in the chat. But there are also other people as well who've been involved. We've been working as a team for about the last 12 years, developing live online learning experiences for our students, and also doing some research into those experiences. So we can share a little bit of that with you today, but we would also be delighted to hear from you about some of your experiences as well, and hopefully there'll be the opportunity for you to put some of those into the chat as we go through. So just to say hello and welcome, and Chris, would you like to say hello too?
Hello, yes.
Yeah, okay. So if we could move on to the first slide, please. Thank you. Just before we start, I don't know about you, but we've been working a lot this week and last week in live online systems of various sorts. There have been various technical problems along the way as everybody's moving to internet-based meetings and teaching and so on. So what I thought I'd do is start us off actually with the last slide, give you the key messages. So if your internet does cut out, or the cat needs letting out, or whatever else is going on around you needs attending to, at least you've got those and something to take away from this. So the three key things I think we're working towards with this little presentation are things we've learned from our experiences that really make a difference when you're designing, putting together, delivering live online learning. And the first one is very much working together. You could do this on your own, you could set this up, you could design your courses, you could do your teaching on your own, but it's much easier and a much better experience, I think, if you can work together and you can collaborate with colleagues to do that, and also with your learners, with your students. They have a lot to offer in terms of live online learning and their experiences with technology. So I think working together with them as well is a good way of progressing. The second key message is about engaging everybody, and this is really kind of a process of engagement, starting right from the beginning of a course or a program, really acknowledging people, getting them set up, letting them engage with the technology, but also then developing into an effective learning community and making sure everybody can interact in a way that suits them. So that's the second one. And then the third key message is about the importance as we move into using something like this or developing our practice around the new technologies. Really the importance is highlighted of reflection. We're very keen in our team on ideas of reflection and do that on our own and do it with others through dialogue and discussions. And that has been a really valuable way for us to learn and develop our practices we've gone through. So we'll talk a little bit about that as well at the end. So what we're going to do is we're going to take you through some of the challenges that we've identified in terms of working with live online learning. But first of all, I'm going to get Eleanor to put the next slide up. We'd like to find a little bit more actually about what you think are some of the challenges of live online learning. Some of you may be teachers in schools, in colleges, in universities. You may be just starting out. You may have lots of experience. Just let us know a little bit about what you think the biggest challenge is for you, and then we can kind of pick up on some of those as we go through, and also take the opportunity to compare them with some of the things that we've identified. I'll just pause for a second while people get to find the chat. or the questions box?
Yeah, so lots of things coming up in the questions box. One of them is not knowing if students are engaged because I can't see them. And then other things about missing the body language, tech glitches, getting used to the technology. There's some for starters.
Excellent, excellent. Yeah, I think many of those we've certainly got on our list as well. But if you could move us on to the next slide, please. Titles meeting environments. So the word learning, I think, is really important, and it's really important to keep a focus on that.
Sorry, Sarah, I think we lost audio for a couple of minutes there. Would you mind just repeating what you started with?
Yes, yeah. So I think the most important challenge is this idea of focusing on learning and creating an effective learning environment. We've put three components of this up around our triangle here that we'll touch on each of these, and some of the challenges clearly fit into these three categories. But the three areas being the technology, there's definitely a challenge for many people. The pedagogy, how you encourage that engagement that people were talking about. And then the idea of creating an effective learning community and picking up on things like feedback from your students where you can't see them. So that would be our biggest challenge. But what we're going to do then is just ask you another question now, and then we're going to pick up on some of the issues that you find particularly demanding in this environment. So if we could have the next question, please. So if you could tell us, you can create as many. I'm sure some of you would think of more than three, but if you can come up with three things that you have to do during a live online session, that would be fantastic. And we'll get Eleanor to report those back in just a second.
Yeah, so some of the ones coming up are listen, type and talk, give very clear instructions, check understanding, try to keep an eye on everyone, set expectations.
Excellent. Okay, that's super. Let's move on then, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the things that we've found out and get some input from Chris as well. This is actually a slide that we put together after a piece of research that we've done into instructors' experiences of using live online learning, and you can see some keywords there: demanding, exhausting, intense. That seemed to be the overriding message that came back from people who were working in this environment. It's hard work. There's a lot to keep your eyes on. As somebody just said there, you've got to talk, type and listen all at once, and that's not easy to do, and it does take practice. So if you could move us on, please, Eleanor. This is the list we put together, which is quite comprehensive, but not fully comprehensive. There are probably many other things that you could add to this, and you've put up on your lists as well. Chris, I don't know if you'd like to come in just at this point and talk about your own experiences of finding it a demanding environment.
I suppose the other thing that I would want to point out is that you're often not just managing the online classroom itself, but you're also managing other channels of communication, like the phone ringing, people emailing you saying they're stuck, in distress, lost, and so that it's about keeping an eye on all those things and trying to acknowledge all the participants, encouraging them to keep in touch with each other as well, so that they can help if there are difficulties.
Yeah, and it's quite hard, isn't it, sometimes if you've got those technical difficulties going on, to then focus on the pedagogy, on the learning element. They can be quite distracting.
Yes, but if the people are not there, then the pedagogy isn't relevant.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to the next slide then, and we've got a few suggestions. First one of which links back to the key point that I raised at the beginning, the idea of sort of working with other people. And I think for us, certainly as us as a team, and from the work that we've done, this seems to be really critical. It's really helpful if you can work with other people to design your sessions, to plan them, to prepare them, and particularly to facilitate them. I mean, there's 3 of us here today, and I think that's really valuable. It has lots of benefits. You know, different people can take on different roles. They notice different things going on. And they can provide feedback at the end and different perspectives on how things have gone. So I think that's a really important point there. The second suggestion is one that I've already mentioned again, about working with your learners. There's a tendency to think that you have to be the expert, I think, for many people, and particularly when you move into this unfamiliar environment, it tends to, or it can kind of encourage a bit of a retreat back to that expert role. And the fact that we rely very much on audio, for example, today, means that there's a lot of talking that goes on, and perhaps not quite so much interaction as you would like in some cases. So working with learners is a really good way to sort of ease the pressure that you might feel under as a facilitator. And learners, of course, have a lot of technical expertise of their own, and some very good ideas for their own learning, and those can be really helpful when it comes to designing these sessions. And then the third point there is about building a community, helping learners get to know each other, to get to know you, to find different ways that they can contribute to sessions, and to help them understand how the technology works so that they can engage and make a contribution. Chris, would you like to come in there with any examples or suggestions?
I think the thing I'd like to say is if you are working on your own, then the importance of recognizing your mistakes and being prepared to unpick those with colleagues is really important. That there are times when inevitably you make mistakes, when you realize afterwards that you could have done something to sort something out. And the key to getting that in proportion is to have that team of supportive colleagues who will help you to understand the things that you could have done differently. I think the other point I'd really want to draw on is that idea of working with the learners and using that to encourage a community to develop. That if learners begin to feel they can help each other, that they're not totally dependent on you, it takes some of the load off. You can find people raising and sorting problems in a chat box while you're doing something completely different. And all you need to do is say great or well done or thank you at the end of that. I do think it's really important just to acknowledge the contribution that learners make. And even things like just saying hello at the beginning of a session, making sure everybody knows how to use a microphone, everybody knows how to use the chat box, giving extra little instructions or reminders as you go through can be really helpful.
Thank you. Yeah, Eleanor, is there anything coming up in the chat or the questions that's relevant here?
Coming up now that you said that. So somebody asked about specifically about learners with special needs, such as dyslexia.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And shall I ask you another question as well, or
yeah, why don't you do a couple and then we can try and pick up on them as we're going through, maybe answer some now if it's appropriate.
Sure. Is it important to encourage teacher-free communication channels for students, and how to manage interactions in breakout groups, and also reconciling working as a team with the university's workload allocation of module leaders' roles to one person only?
Okay, brilliant. Let's pick up on the workload issue. I think first that might be the most appropriate one here, and then we'll perhaps come back to the other ones, which I think we'll pick up as we go through because we're in the next section. The workload one, yeah, that's a really tough one, isn't it? It's universities are quite strict and have different models and different approaches to working out how much time it spends. In our own case, I think we've always worked as a team, so that was helpful. But we have also collaborated with people outside the team as we've developed things, and actually some of the other people who've been particularly valuable. I mean, we couldn't have done what we have done without working with people like the learning technologists. So actually that's an extra resource in a sense that you can draw on, and most universities have people in those roles now, and they certainly will do after the current crisis. But those people can be kind of extra resources for a team to work with, or an individual to work with to help you. And in fact, some of our very early sessions, the first ones that we did, we always made sure that there was one of the learning technologists was there with us to help us with technical issues that we weren't familiar with. So I think that would be perhaps a word of advice if your team is small and if the workload allocation is small and you need a bit of extra resources, to look out with your team and see who else can be out there to help you. Okay, Chris, would you like to add anything, or shall we move on to thinking more?
I think the points about teacher-free interaction are really interesting. I'd want to come back to those. The idea of dyslexia too, I think we maybe pick up on later, but it's really important to set an atmosphere in which people feel able to make mistakes as well. And I'm aided by my rotten typing, which becomes a topic of comment and humour in all the groups that I teach, but that does help to also provide some cover for people who find it difficult to type quickly.
Yeah, I certainly agree with that. I think it's quite useful, isn't it, to sometimes make a few mistakes so that learners don't feel they have to be perfect either, and can admit the things that they might find difficult. It's a good one. Okay, we've started talking about learners, so let's move on to the next slide, and we'll pick up on the breakout rooms and some of the other issues later. Again, a chance for you to put in a few comments if you like. Do you know what your learners think about live online learning, or if perhaps you haven't got learners yet, what you think about it, if you've done any learning this way? What are your opinions? What are your experiences? What do they like? What do they find frustrating? It links nicely back to the challenge somebody set us at the beginning about how do you work when you can't see your learners, I think, this one.
Some comments coming in. Someone says their students find it quite intimidating. Others say their students love it because they can attend in their pajamas. Some are quite expert and can be rather critical of the lecturer. Some of the older students are struggling.
Okay.
And also there seems to be issues with attendance.
Okay, yeah, so real diversity there actually, isn't that? Everything from struggling to being an expert. Let's move on to the next slide then, and we'll share with you some of our students' experiences and pick up on those issues. So we did quite a lot of research when we started out into our learners' experiences, because we realized that as facilitators, we hadn't been learners in this kind of environment. So we didn't know what it felt like, what the experience was like to be a learner. And actually, we'll make this point again later, but I think one of the most useful things you can do as a facilitator is actually to be a learner yourself in these spaces, to try it out, to see how you find it. And that's a really useful source of information, if you like, and experience to help you with your design of sessions. But we found some things that you might expect from our learners. Some of them were quite obvious bits of feedback they gave us, but some were less obvious. And I'm just going to start with you have a look at the comments in the brown boxes first, brown speech bubbles first. This was a learner who, and you know, we were trying to engage everybody, to ask questions, get everybody talking in these sessions. And this was clearly a learner who didn't like that, who found that was a bit intimidating, and couldn't respond in that way. So that was quite useful information for us in terms of thinking about, okay, how are we going to get everybody to interact and engage? We need to have perhaps a variety of approaches to that. The learner, the purple speech bubble at the top there, this links to the idea of breakout rooms. This was an interesting piece of information for us. In the system we were using initially, there were options to move participants to breakout rooms automatically, and often we used that feature and everybody suddenly found themselves in another room, and this learner and others gave us similar feedback. That was quite a confusing experience to go through. Suddenly you were in one space and then you'd moved somewhere else and you weren't quite sure how you got there sometimes, and it kind of takes away your control over what you're doing. So this links to the idea of giving learners a bit of independence in the spaces. It can be helpful, if you can, to let learners do things for themselves, to move themselves around the space, to have a little bit of control there so they don't feel disempowered in a sense. And then the bottom point there is about group work, and possibly group work in breakout rooms. One thing that is quite difficult to do is to monitor how breakout rooms are going, how groups are working in breakout rooms or in separate spaces. And our learners identified that there were people who we called minimalists, who didn't necessarily engage very well in such activities, and that would create stress for other students. So if you're in a group or a breakout room where somebody is not communicating, that can be quite a difficult situation to deal with if you're a learner. So there are things that we can do to help with that. And perhaps I can bring Chris in here at that point, because I know she'll have some suggestions around that particular one.
Yeah, I think that the breakout, that it is important for people to have spaces where they can talk away from the tutor, where they can. Sorry, I was a bit distracted, Sarah. Can you recap what you said? Because I was looking at a message in the chat box
That's
from
all right.
somebody saying that they can't see the chat thread.
Yeah, the issue I just raised was about minimalists, the stress for learners of group work in this kind of space.
Yeah, it's about trying to give
might...
groups the option about who will contribute if they're going to be in a group setting, trying to manage that by setting time limits, by sending messages onto those groups saying it's 5 minutes on, you should be letting the second person speak now, or saying 5 minutes left, you should be on to the second last person's ideas, making sure that you're monitoring those groups in some sort of way. Even if that's just sending out regular reminders to them, that gives then the learner the opportunity to intervene in the process and say, we should perhaps be, and moving on and so on.
Yeah, I think the other issue around that, Chris, that occurs to me as you're talking there is the importance of really clear instructions, straightforward instructions, possibly replicated on whiteboard screens or somewhere, somehow, so that people can refer back to them. I think we've all made the mistake of sending learners off to a breakout room before we finish giving them the instructions on what they're supposed to do there. And that isn't very helpful, obviously, when you're a learner and trying to work effectively as a group. Let's move on to the next slide, Eleanor, because I think there's some more issues on that one that we can pick up on now, which link to perhaps to some of the things that people have mentioned. I don't know if there's anything else coming up in the chat, but these are certainly some questions that we've had to grapple with as we've been developing our practice, you know, from things about how to get everybody contributing to discussions, making sure that people have a way of having their voice heard. And one of my favorite one is actually that third one there, about silences. Silences are really awkward in this kind of space. You suddenly wonder whether the technology is working properly, or whether everybody's left, whether you're just the only person in your space. I think that's a really interesting one. Chris, I don't know whether that's one that you've had to grapple with too. Yes,
it is. I think it's useful in silences to use the emoticons that are available in quite a lot of systems, so you can get people to show a happy face, a sad face, a confused face. You can ask people to put their hands up in order. The system we use has that facility. If they want to say anything, or you can say, is everybody happy to move on? And again, get emoticon feedback.
Yeah, another thing I think is that silences are sometimes quite important, aren't they? I mean, some people do need thinking time before they can formulate an answer. It goes back to our student who didn't like being put on the spot.
And I think this is about the relaxed atmosphere in a seminar. If it can be, if the people in the group feel relaxed enough to be able to say when they're stuck, when you feel relaxed enough to say to the group, are you still hearing me? That can all help.
Yeah. And the other one I can think of for silences is actually to have a managed silence, to have, say, right, we're having 3 minutes to think about this, and then we'll collect your responses. So to actually make it a formal silence, that can be a good way to give thinking time, so it doesn't feel like
a timer function that can be really helpful there too.
Exactly. Yes. Eleanor, are there any points coming up in the chat or the questions that relate to some of these questions?
Someone's saying silences can be important to allow time. There's a few comments like that. And so, people were asking about the breakout groups that you mentioned a few times, and what platform that was on.
Okay, we've used a couple of different platforms. We started on Illuminate and we've moved to Collaborate and now Collaborate Ultra for most of our teaching. But we've all probably got experience of other systems as well. Adobe Connect, I think you can have breakout rooms there as well. But certainly in Collaborate, they're a strong feature of the system and one that we use, I think, probably almost every session that we run. If you can't have breakout rooms, another sort of variation on approach that we have used, we have a very large group for one of our sessions and we want them to work in smaller groups first. And what we've done there is actually just to set up completely separate sessions. So rather than have great breakout rooms, we have groups meeting in different online spaces and then all coming together for a plenary type discussion in a separate room. And that works very well as well, and is an alternative if you haven't got sort of breakout room facilities within the system you're using.
People are also commenting that Zoom has useful breakout rooms. Somebody.
Sorry, Eleanor. I also sometimes use other group software to let people have discussions if they want to. So sometimes people will talk in a Facebook chat or a WhatsApp chat instead of the breakout room, as long as they're keeping an eye on the main room so that they know when to come back. That can work quite well too.
Yeah, somebody's also put a question around the breakout rooms, how to monitor them. Another suggestion for breakout rooms is Microsoft Teams. And somebody has also asked about or mentioned the potential for using live quizzing tools on a website called mentimeter.com.
Oh yes, I'm a fan of that one too. I like the Mentimeter quizzes and things you could put those in, and there's lots of polling tools and things like that that you could do similar within some of these systems as well. So yeah, it's worth experimenting, and if you've got an idea for something you'd like to do, you'll probably find a way to do it somehow. Either within your system or by bringing another piece of software. I think the breakout room question is a really interesting one. I'm just going to come back to that one very briefly. Someone was asking about how you monitor what's going in breakout rooms, and I think that links to the last question on this list actually as well, about giving learners responsibility. I mean, ultimately, it's nice when you know that your learners will just go off to breakout rooms and start the task and get on with it, and that does happen. And I think if your tasks are clear, if you've got good timings, people are comfortable with each other and know how to communicate, that does often happen. People will use the time very effectively, certainly in my experience, to work in small groups. And I think sometimes it can actually be damaging to go around and try and monitor too much. It's because as soon as you drop into a breakout room, the conversation between learners may stop and they may think, oh, we've got to listen to the tutor's arrived now, or they've got something important to say, and it's kind of like interrupting the group. So sometimes, giving learners a little bit of responsibility and leaving them to it can be just as effective as monitoring very closely.
I think the monitoring can come in at the stage of, have they done the task well? But that also involves a bit of reflective discussion with the learners, where if one group has done the task very purposefully and achieved really good results and another one hasn't, it's about saying, why did your group work well? Can you give me any ideas or any feedback of what I can do differently with that task that would make it work better for you?
Yeah, great, thank you. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to move us on to the next slide then, Eleanor, please. I was expecting another one, but that's fine. Yeah, so these are our suggestions for engaging people and making sure you're getting that community working together and learning together in these environments. Some of these we've not gone into in any detail, but perhaps we can just pick up on a couple before we move on. So encouraging engagement right from the start, making sure people know each other, they're comfortable with each other, they know how the system works. Monitoring participation, and Not thinking there specifically of breakout rooms, but also of, you know, just from the beginning of working with a particular group of students, it's very useful just to check on who is using what kinds of tools. I said this to Chris as we were preparing this the other day, but I still often have a piece of paper next to me when I'm working online with a list of my students on, and I can jot down if somebody seems to be having particular technical problems, or if somebody's the one who contributes every time from a group, so I can just see how things are going for individuals and pick up on any issues there might be there.
I also try and have the participant panel open, which is available in Collaborate, which lets you see whose microphone is on. If you're watching 4 breakout rooms and you find that in one breakout room, one person's microphone has been consistently active throughout the session, you know there's something going wrong that you need to look at.
Yeah. I think the fourth one on here is quite an important one, the one about being flexible. I mean, Chris mentioned there about flexibility she offers in terms of group works and using other technologies and so on. I think that's also the way that we can work to help people like the dyslexic student that was mentioned earlier, by being flexible about which tools we use, letting the students guide us in some cases as to what works best for them, rather than us always being prescriptive. So I think that's a really important piece of advice in terms of dealing with the diversity of learners that we do come across. Okay.
Yes, some love to type in the chat box. Some are much keener to contribute in the main session with the microphone. Others will only contribute in the breakout room, but then you'll know they're taking part because they'll get a report back that mentions them by name.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, let's move on, Eleanor. So I just wanted to flag, we did some research into our learners' experiences, as I said at the beginning, and one of the things that we did some time ago, and if you're interested, you can chase this up, was to put together a list of recommendations for how to, for facilitators based on our learners' experiences. There are about 10 or 11 altogether, so I'm not going to go through them all, but if you're interested, please feel free to follow up with that one. But let's move on, because we've got a few minutes left, and I'd like to get to our third area of challenge. So this one was about learning. Again, this is an opportunity for you to type into the chat box and tell us, how have you learned about live online learning? I suspect for many people it will be through having hands-on experience and being thrown in at the deep end, but let's find out what's been useful for people and how we can actually develop our skills and practice as facilitators.
Okay, some comments coming in. Someone saying trial and error, experience and student feedback, sessions like yours and discussions with colleagues, more trial and error, preparing students in advance before launching it in full so they have time to test it, working in small teams with examples and discussion.
Yeah. Great, good. Yes, I think the trial and error one probably will be the most common by the end, but definitely it's nice to hear that people are being able to work in teams to do that and work with their learners too. Let's put up our slide then that's got some points on it here. These are bits of feedback and real quotes from facilitators. The first one I think links to the comment that somebody made earlier about not really being able to see what your learners are doing and not having that face-to-face contact, and it's one that was really stuck with me. As a good description of sometimes what it's like in these spaces, teaching with a blindfold on, which makes it quite hard to get that feedback to help you develop your practice. So that's something that we do need to consider. I think the second one as well is as we've changed from one system to another over the years, and now in this environment where suddenly we're being thrown into using all kinds of different tools for online collaboration, as soon as you get the hang of something, it throws a new challenge at you. Either there's a new version released or you get asked to use a different system or whatever. So there's a continual learning process that needs to go on in connection with this kind of practice. And then I think the last point is a useful one as well to bear in mind, that because of the demands of the environment, as a facilitator, you're doing so many things at once. It's really difficult when you're in there in the thick of it to really think about, okay, what am I learning here? So reflection is a really useful process, a really useful thing to do when you're working in these environments, to keep you learning about what you're doing and actually help you unpack what is going on in the sessions. And that reflection either independently or with others is a really useful tool. So yeah, sorry, the next slide popped up there, but let's go on to that one. And perhaps I'll bring Chris in at this point, see if she wants to say anything about the ways that we've really developed our skills and what's been most useful for her.
I think one of the things that is very useful is actually watching a recording of your own sessions. It can be excruciating, but it does actually allow you to think about what you were doing and whether you've done it in the way you intended. Really useful if you can then discuss what's been going on with somebody else. Being an online learner, yes, it's been really helpful to me to be involved in other people's online groups to find out that when you're talking to that blank space, people will be in all sorts of different states of engagement with what you're saying. The only time you can really guarantee that they're engaged is when they're talking or creating something themselves. And that leads me to always want to make activities rather than to try and talk at people. I think the other thing is to begin to believe in what learners can do for themselves in those teacher-free spaces, interactive spaces that were mentioned earlier. We've actually moved in the online group I teach most regularly to having sessions where the peer group can meet together. And in that setting, people can often come up with solutions for themselves. I'll occasionally get an email after that sort of session asking for clarification, but often people will just tell me what they've managed to solve.
That's really useful. Yeah. So it's also a way of getting a bit of learner feedback there as well, isn't it? You're getting comments back from them on how they're managing to work with things. Yeah. And I think that's an important point too, is we almost kind of need to be a little bit more systematic about getting learner feedback so that we do understand what the learner experience is and where they're finding challenges as we go through.
Yeah.
Okay.
There was quite a lot in the chat while you were talking there of people.
Excellent. Good.
Also commenting, sending out quick, simple feedback forms after each session to elicit feedback, and then other people making the point that it's helpful to express explicitly state to students that the process is messy and that you're all learning together.
That's a lovely comment to finish on there. Yeah, perfect. Let's move on to the key messages then. So there we go. There were our key messages. Just to reiterate, working together, working with colleagues and with students, as somebody's just suggested, trying to engage everybody and reflecting and learning and developing practice as we go. I think that's the core of what we wanted to say. We realized yesterday as we were practicing this that we could talk for hours, Chris and I, and tell you all sorts of things, but we only have 45 minutes today, so we won't go any further. I'll just perhaps ask Chris if there's any final comments you want to make, and then really if you could keep the chat going in the discussion boxes, and then we'll pick up on points and then we'll feed them back to us. That would be lovely. Thank you very much.
I think my only comment is remember how you behave in real life, that there's a real tendency to be pushed into a kind of online podcast guru, which is not a teacher. If you want to be a teacher, behave like a teacher. So that means saying hello to your students and having a genial relationship with them as well as delivering content. And I think that's one of the things that's hardest to remember.
Thank you. Eleanor, is there? I'm sure there are some very.
Should we go to some questions?
Yes, please. Yes.
Let's have a look. How long can most students work online effectively?
That's a really good question. When we first started out, we had some 3-hour sessions. I don't know what we thought we were doing, but we were trying to convert from what was a face-to-face course to an online one. And I think initially we had some 3-hour sessions. They didn't last very long. I would say an hour and a half absolute maximum, but with a break in it as you go, is plenty of time to sit with headphones on at a computer screen. And we have to think about, well-being of people as well. It's not easy, is it, to focus on something that's quite intense for an extended period. So shorter is often better. And Chris's approach, where she mentioned there, where she has her every fortnightly sessions with the students, and then they have a session on their own in between, that means that she's been able to break up her program into shorter sessions more frequently, and leave some of them to the students as well. And that has been a very effective way of having more concentrated periods of time for the actual learning. People might have other suggestions. Maybe they have managed with 3 hours, but I think that's probably too long.
Another question here around GDPR. So a lot of programs, you recommended some programs and apps, and other people have been suggesting those in the chat box. And someone was asking whether those are kind of compatible with GDPR.
That's a very good question, a very important one actually, isn't it? Chris, you've used some various tools. How do you address some of those issues?
I think the important thing is to get people's consent and to make them very aware of what they're sharing and where. I think it's important, if you're recording, that you always make that absolutely clear to people. If they're in a breakout room and have a reasonable expectation of being private in that breakout room, you don't just appear in the room. I think there's all these kinds of issues, but there are also things where, when you're working with, as we do, people who are in a work-based setting, you need to be very careful that they don't end up saying things on a recorded session which take names of other people or circumstances which are recognizable into the situation. It's about being alert to it, I think.
Okay, should we have another question?
Yep.
How do you help learners learn about the software straight before the session or through a separate session ahead of the session?
That's a really good question as well. I like that one. I think my approach, and Chris may have a slightly different approach, but my approach has always been to start simple. So and sort of help them build their skills as you go through a program of sessions. So yes, if I'm working with a brand new group of students who've never been into the space before, then if it's possible, we'll have some opportunity for them to just make sure that they can access it before we have the first formal session. So there'll be, I have like an open office hour where they can perhaps log in and just come in and say hello to me, and we can have a quick look at some of the tools so that they feel a bit more comfortable when they arrive for the first sort of formal session, if you like. And then what I would do through the first few formal sessions is sort of gradually build up the range of tools that we're using. So in the first one, we might just use the chat box so we can do a bit of written communication alongside the audio. The next one we might have a poll. The next one we might add in something else. Breakout rooms we probably add in quite early on, because that's a key one often for getting students to collaborate and interact together. But I think you sort of gradual approach, not trying to ensure that, or not trying to make them have to know everything at the beginning, but gradually build their skills as well. I think that's quite a useful approach.
Yeah, I completely agree. I do think we're very fortunate in one of the courses in that we have a face-to-face session initially, in which we then use the technology together, often with one or two remote participants, but that means that everybody has an idea of who everybody else is, and they're more able to be confident to ask for help with any of the tools. But building in more and more complex tools, not trying to introduce them all at once, and making sure that every time you use something, you remind students how to access it. So they may worry that they need to move themselves into breakout rooms. You need to say, I will move you, or say, I have given you permission to move yourself. So make sure that every instruction is explicit. I find too that photographs of people can really help that interaction, that if you can make a resource which saves photos of people, they can then picture the other people in the room, even though they're just interacting by voice. People who are normally teaching face-to-face and who've been moved all of a sudden online can build on existing relationships, but you might need to create them if you're with a new group.
Okay, shall we go to another question?
Yeah.
Okay, we've got one here from earlier, and that was more of a discussion point around whether as lecturers you're trying to recreate the live learning pedagogy such as Q&A groups, breakout, etc., as opposed to kind of fundamentally changing your pedagogy for online learning and what that might look like.
Oh, that's a good complex question, that one, isn't it? We could spend a little while on that one. Yeah, I think that's yeah, absolutely. Do you want me to start and then you can chip in, Chris? We have very much we know where we're heading with our course and our team. We're very much into collaborative learning. We're into I guess authentic learning. We're into getting people to be reflective. So we know what the underpinning aspirations are when we're designing our learning, and those inform whether we're working face-to-face or online. And what we've actually found is that we can do most of the same things online that we can do face-to-face. There have been very few exceptions, but most of the kind of approaches and strategies that we've used face-to-face, particularly around discussion groups, particularly around getting students to prepare things and present them back, that can all be done online. So there's no real difference needed to pedagogy. It's just a question of just doing it in a slightly different way, and sometimes having to be a little bit creative about the tools that are being used or the approaches that are being used. But I think the most important thing is to have that underpinning. Okay, what am I trying to achieve here? I want to develop an effective learning community. I want my students to be working together. I want this, that, and the other. You know, it depends on your context what is most appropriate. But if you keep that in mind and you think creatively about the tools, then I think most things that you want to do, you should be able to achieve, there with very few exceptions.
I think one of the things that strikes me about the way we've worked as a team is because we have parallel live sessions, face-to-face live sessions and live online sessions. We need to agree processes that will work in both situations. And this actually exposes flaws in the face-to-face work as much as it exposes difficulties in the online situation, that you can, by really analysing those underlying purposes, as Sarah says, nothing makes you clearer than trying to work out how you're going to put something into practice, both as a face-to-face session and as an online session. It can really help you to see the assumptions you've made, the points where learners might lose engagement, and so on.
Okay, thanks. Would you like to take one last question, or shall we wrap up?
One more question is fine. People are still listening, yeah, which is great.
Yeah, somebody had a question around doing an online session, stopping it for individual work and then reconvening online after, and whether that's a good idea, whether you'd get a full cohort back or people would drift away.
That's a nice one, isn't it? Yeah, I think there's all kinds of different ways that you can use these. You don't have to be online together all the time, and actually to mix up the approaches to do a real blended learning kind of thing is often a very good strategy. We do that exactly that. We have some of our workshops actually have moved from being completely live online sessions to being something that combines both synchronous and asynchronous communication over the course of a week. And the focus has got to be on the task. You know, to make that work, the focus has got to be on what have the students got to be able to do, or what should they have done by the end of it. So if you've got different components like that, as long as the students, I think, are really clear about what the expectations are and have some clear tasks to do in the various stages, and know that there is, you know, it really does depend on them having done those for the next bit to work. They should engage. You're always going to have some issues, aren't you? There'll be some reasons why people don't engage in the sort of follow-up bit. But I think if you get them interested, if you get them producing things to share, to working together and so on, there's no reason why that kind of blended experience can't be very effective.
Yep.
Okay, thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Chris. I think here's probably a good point to wrap up. But yeah, I hope everyone found the webinar useful and interesting. And we've recorded this session and we'll be sending out the recording as soon as it's available. So thank you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to everybody. We've had some great questions and comments coming through there, and I'll be going back through the chat as well to have a look to see what other people have put in. So thanks for your contributions.
Great, thanks everyone.